Thank you for coming to this workshop. My name is Ann Barker. I'm one of the reference librarians. I'm the chair of the copyright team in the library. So I have been sort of copyright point person for the library since around 1999, which was a time when a lot of copyright stuff was changing. So I don't have legal credentials. So I have to be very clear up front. I don't give any legal opinions. A lot of times you might have a question. I'll say, aha, good question. I'll go find out for you and get back to you. So I don't claim to be an expert really, but what I try to do is stay on top of things and point you to good sources of information. So what I've planned for this workshop is to give you a quick overview just of the framework of copyright, particularly as it applies to the classrooms or looking in an educational setting, what you'd be doing in a class or what students might be doing. So a quick overview of the framework, and then we'll walk through the process or I've got kind of a flow chart in mind of how you would walk through. I've got this thing, can I use it? What can I do with it in the educational setting? And then I'm going to point you to some other resources that would give you a place to start looking in the future. And then I'm always here to answer questions. We do have legal counsel at the university, but they are like everywhere, they're spread pretty thin. So they have vetted the information that we give out and have said we're on the right track. So we're sort of the first line for questioning things about copyright. And then if we think this is getting beyond us, we need to go get hold of legal counsel, we'll do that. So we can refer you if needed. That all sound like it's on target? We give you what you want. Seeing some thumbs up there. Okay, and certainly feel free to interrupt me at any point. I did this sort of as a PowerPoint. We do have a number of web guides that are up that I'll show you at the end, but I'm doing this from home today. I just got results from a COVID test that I don't have COVID, so I'm very happy, but I've been working from home for a while and I'm concerned about bandwidth. So I sort of put this together as a PowerPoint presentation so we can run through a slide deck and not worry about things lagging or buffering too much. And then at the end, we'll sort of go live and look at some of the web pages that we've got to support you. And do feel free to interrupt me, tell me to slow down. If you've got a specific question that you feel isn't being addressed, interrupt and let me know. Probably best to do that verbally. I'm not sure I can keep an eye on the screen and on chat at the same time. So let's go on with that. So let's see if I can make this work. There we go. Okay. So copyright's very puzzling. If you feel puzzled, you are not alone. Lots of people feel puzzled by it and it's easy to get kind of lost in it. And it can be scary for some people, I think, because people feel like they might be taking a risk and someone might come after them legally. I think your risks in the educational setting are fairly minimal. So we'll hope to make this a little bit more comfortable for you. So there are some things to step through. I think it's helpful to start with thinking of the purpose of copyright and keep that in mind. It makes a lot more sense of some of the legal details if you've got this purpose in mind. So in the Constitution, it says the purpose is to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. So the idea is that those who are creative should have a chance to get a return on the investment of their creativity. But it's for a limited time because we know any future inventions, discoveries, creativity are often based on the creativity of the past. So we want to encourage both the return on the investment, but also the invention of new things. So keep that balance in mind. I think most of the law is aiming at maintaining that balance. So what's covered by copyright? This is important to know. It's not the idea or ideas per se. It's an original work of authorship fixed in any tangible medium of expression. So originality is important. Just a list of ingredients, like for a recipe, or a list like a phone directory is not necessarily particularly original. So that probably would not be covered. If I just speak into the air, that's not fixed in a tangible medium. So that's not covered by copyright. But since we're recording this, the recording is fixed in a tangible medium of expression. So that is covered. Copyright now, the current law exists for the life of the author plus 70 years. And there's no need to register or use that copyright symbol. Since around 1992, the law was changed to make us more in agreement with the international standards, and registration is no longer required. So everything is just automatically covered by copyright. So if you're looking at this and thinking of what you might use in the classroom, can you think of anything that would not be covered by copyright that you think you might use? Anybody have any ideas?
I think one challenge can be with streaming media, especially for online classes.
Okay, so that would be covered by copyright. Often it's, I think a streaming file or a digital file, it feels like, well, that's not very tangible. That's floating around out there in the ether, but it exists somewhere on a disk. It's actually imprinted somewhere in its digital format. So that is something that's fixed in a tangible medium. So that would be covered by copyright. So we do need to be concerned about that. Anything else you can think of that would not be?
Well, I suppose anything that's outside of the copyright is no longer valid for it.
Right. So something that's in the public domain, something that's old enough that it's fallen out of copyright, or it was never registered. If it was from the time period when registration was required and it wasn't registered, it might be out of copyright. Anything else? Y'all may be more savvy. I think a lot of people kind of assume, well, like student work. My student work isn't copyrighted, right? Well, yes. As long as it's original, it's from the moment it's created, that's covered. So you really should ask permission of students before using their work, putting it up on a screen, so forth. I think students get confused because it's so easy for us technologically to share materials back and forth technologically. I can post it on the internet. I just got it off the internet. Surely that's not covered by copyright, but think again, that's all covered by copyright, or generally is covered by copyright. Any other questions or ideas of things that might come up? Okay, well, you can keep that in mind. We'll come back to that. Let's make this work. Okay, whoops, skipped one. Okay, these are the rights of the copyright holder. And I think if you look at these, it can begin to feel like we can't do anything. So these are the exclusive rights of the copyright holder to make copies, to distribute the work, to make derivative works, which could be an adaptation, a summary, a translation, to publicly display or perform the work. And publicly doesn't necessarily mean for pay. It can mean in any setting beyond the family circle. So singing in church would be a public performance. Technically holding something up in a classroom, singing a song out on speaker circle, those would be public performances or displays of works. Or to license things to third parties to do any of these things. So these are the exclusive rights of the copyright holder, which can feel pretty restrictive, but you can see these are all things that would allow the creative person to get return on their investment. And then the law carves out things that are exceptions. So we have some specific exceptions that are written into the law. So section 110 covers classroom performance and display. And notice it's performance and display. It's not covering the copying, reproduction, the possible breaking of encryption to deal with a video that's been encrypted, for example. Section 108 covers the reproduction of libraries and archives. That's what allows us to do things like interlibrary loan or to digitize works for preservation purposes. Those are specific exemptions that are written into the law. And then beyond that, there are the general fair use principles. So these are what we mainly want to focus on today, I think. Fair use can feel a little vague. It's intentionally vague. That gives us some flexibility. It can make people a little nervous. So we're going to talk a little about how you would sort out whether your potential use is a fair use. So it's weighing these 4 different factors. Often educators will focus on the purpose of the use. So well, I'm doing it for an educational purpose, so it must be all right. Yes. That's just one of the factors. You also have to look at the nature of the work that you're using, the amount of the work you're using, and the potential impact on the market. So again, it's balancing that need to use something to create something new versus the return to the original creator. So it's sort of balancing all of those different things. So very much that balancing act. Okay, so here are the steps you might go through in thinking through this. So first off, is the thing you're wanting to use covered by copyright? So one is, how old is it? Right now, each year, things fall out of copyright, go into the public domain. But the standard for right now is life of the author plus 70 years. So you need to look at how old is this thing? Is it covered by copyright? Is it a US government publication that you're trying to use? The federal government publications, since they're tax supported, they automatically go into the public domain. So they're usually not covered by copyright. They're free for anybody to use. Then one exception would be if the government contracted with another entity to create something, then that might have some restrictions on it. Another thing that comes up a lot in library land more and more as we're using online things is whether there is a license or some sort of user agreement that governs the use of materials. So for example, all the library databases, the online journals that we get, the ebooks, the videos that we supply, most of our online materials are governed by a license. We contract with a company to provide those. And we agree to a license which spells out what sort of use can be made of those things, what sort of obligations we have for them. So you're probably familiar, most of our things are restricted to use by university employees or students. So people have to log in with their university single sign-on in order to get access to these things. Usually with the databases and the journals, we'll try to negotiate things that would allow us to do the sorts of things we would do with the library exemptions. So we usually try to negotiate an agreement where we can download journal articles and supply them via interlibrary loan to other people who don't have access to it, for example. Ebooks and videos are more difficult. You have probably run into this where those are licensed to the specific university, the specific campus that has purchased them. And often we can't share them the way we would a physical book or a DVD. So there's a doctrine in copyright law of first sale, which is what allows libraries to lend materials, and that does not apply to these licensed materials in the online format. I often get questions about whether people can use YouTube videos or other social media, like things that have been posted on Twitter. Is it okay to just go ahead and use all of that? Those things are often governed by a user agreement, and that's all that fine print that often, I fear most of us click to agree without having read all the fine print, and usually embedded in there are what the poster has agreed to in terms of if they put something up on YouTube, what sort of agreements they've made, and then what the users have agreed to on what they're going to download, what sort of use they can make of that. These can change from time to time. So I find with YouTube videos, when people ask me, I'm often digging around in the fine print, trying to find what's the current stipulation on that. So you might have to look into that. And then you might also run into things like Creative Commons licenses or open access. Is anybody familiar with the Creative Commons? Is that something that is, I see a couple of hands up there. So the Creative Commons and open access are both, as they sort of work in conjunction with copyright. So the materials are still covered by copyright, but the Creative Commons license is a way for the copyright holder to grant usage privileges proactively. So they can proactively say, I'm okay with people using this in this way. So it sort of works in tandem with copyright. So these are all things that are more specific than the general copyright law that might affect what you're able to do. And sometimes it's useful to have those things spelled out. Sometimes it can be frustrating if they seem more restrictive than you think they should be. So let's take a look just at a couple of things. This is something from our guide, and I'll show you at the end how to find this on our copyright guide. This is a handy chart that's put together by Cornell that shows when things go out of copyright. So you can see this is before 1926. It's all in the public domain. Each January 1 now, a new year goes into the public domain, so that date will change from time to time. And then recent things, as I mentioned, are covered for the life of the author plus 70 years. And then in between, there are different circumstances. So copyright used to last for only 14 years, then it was extended to 28 years. Things had to be registered to be covered. So in this in-between time, sometimes something may have gone out of copyright. The copyright might not have been renewed, or it wasn't registered properly to start with. So for these things between 1926 and around 1977, maybe a little bit later than that, there can be some questions, and that involves some investigation. We are very glad to help with this. This involves combing through some of the Copyright Office records to see, was the copyright restored? If the author has died, who inherited those rights, so that it can get a little bit thorny. So we're glad to help with sorting that out. It can be a little bit tricky. I find most people are using either things that are older, that are clearly out of copyright, or things that are more recent, that are clearly still covered by copyright. So the occasions where we have to do that kind of investigation seem to be relatively few. Whoops, sorry, I'm going backwards. I haven't quite figured out how to navigate here. This is just a couple of examples of the Creative Commons licensing, just so you can see what they look like. There's 6 different licenses, and I just copied the top of the page. These are the most open licenses, and then they get progressively more restrictive. So this double C in a circle is the symbol of the Creative Commons. This first license is just saying you can do whatever you want. I just want to be acknowledged. So as long as you acknowledge the author, you can do commercial use, you can do non-commercial use, you can do anything you want with it. And this next one would be the same as long as you're willing to share the new product that you have created. So it's a share alike license. And then they get more restrictive. So some of them will say you can only use this for an educational purpose, not for a commercial purpose. But it's handy to be aware of those and look out for them. And you can also search for things. So for example, within YouTube, you can search for things that have a Creative Commons license. That might give you a little more assurance about using them. Okay, next step. So you've looked at your item, you know whether it's covered by copyright or not. Then the next step is, do the explicit educational exemptions apply? So section 110.1 is one, it's a traditional one for classrooms. We probably all use this without even realizing it. So this is the provision that allows you to show an entire film in a class, play back a piece of music, display an image on a screen, do a performance of a scene of a play, for example. All of those things within the physical classroom are okay because of this exemption. Now the online version gets a little more hairy. So section 110.2 was added when things started going more online. So the Teach Act was written in 2002, and it was to try to make the online environment work similar to the physical environment, but it does have some more restrictions. So it does allow for people to perform or display non-dramatic works of all of these sorts, just as you would in the physical classroom. But then for dramatic works, it gets a little bit more restricted. So for those things, I think they were afraid that showing them in an online environment might undercut the market for the things for like feature films or opera, things of that sort. So they made it explicit that it needs to be just reasonable and limited portions. So there's some guidelines that specify exactly how many minutes or how many frames. I think it's probably safer to use what is the smallest amount that you need for your educational purpose. If you're going to talk about a particular scene, can you limit the display just to that scene? You might have the students have access outside of the classroom to a licensed version of the entire film, for example, but in the class, in that online environment, you might show just the particular clips that you need to make your point. So it needs to be limited. And they also stipulated that you may not post things that are consumable. So like a workbook, it's intended, it's published for students to purchase with the idea they will use it up. So you don't want to post something like that online because that would definitely be undercutting the market. So that's made pretty explicit. Then in addition, there are constraints on the classroom. And what they're trying to do is make the virtual environment act more like the physical classroom. So in a physical classroom, it's a limited group of people who can fit in the classroom. They're there just for the class period. They don't return there after the semester is over. So they're trying to make the virtual environment similar to that. So whatever is shown needs to be the sort of thing that you would show in a classroom in terms of its duration. It needs to be limited to the students officially enrolled in the course. So even like for a film studies class, you really shouldn't have students invite their friends to come view things. It should be limited to the people in the class. And it should be something that's made from lawfully made materials. So we might have to digitize something from a DVD to make it stream. It needs to be made from a copy that was purchased. It shouldn't be downloaded from a pirated site or something like that. And then in addition, there needs to be some way to prevent students from distributing this further. So it needs to use a watermark, or we use streaming a lot, or other provisions to try to prevent students from downloading or hacking the entire content and then making it more widely available. And it needs to carry a copyright warning to students. So these are all provisions just to try to make this online classroom a little bit more like the physical classroom and its limitations. So those are sort of the laid out stipulations. And then if those sort of run parallel to the fair use principle. So one doesn't cancel the other out. It's just these are very specific, but you can also look at the fair use guidelines or the fair use principles and do an evaluation and decide if you think your particular use is fair. I think these things, some people really like having it all spelled out and they like having the rules, and that, that can give a great sense of confidence or assurance. It can also be pretty limiting. So fair use can be handy. It carries a little bit more risk potentially because people can interpret things differently, but it does give some more flexibility. What we do in the library, we really recommend that people use this fair use checklist, which is available from the Copyright Center at the library at the University of Columbia in New York. This was put together by Kenneth Cruz, who has both a library degree and a JD. So he's well qualified to give advice, and he has freely distributed this lovely checklist, which helps you sort of weigh the factors and think through the process. So what we advise people to do is download a copy of this or make an electronic copy of this, fill it out, date it, keep it on file. So then if anybody should challenge your use and come back to you later and say, hey, I think you're infringing, you could say, well, I made a good faith effort. I went through this analysis. I've documented my analysis. I thought this was a fair use. I had good intentions. That limits some of the liability you might have. It just gives some more confidence in arguing about this, I think. So let's walk through some of these things and take a look at them. So I think the one we mainly focus on is the purpose. So favoring fair use, teaching or educational uses, scholarship, criticism, those are all heavily favored. That's tending to create something new. You'll hear people in copyright circles talk a lot about transformative use. You want this to be transformative. We want to be building something new, not just reusing something that someone else has created. Or criticizing it, critiquing it, commenting on it. Obviously, if you want to give good comments or criticism, you need to make the thing itself available so people all know what we're talking about. Parody would be another form of comment, so that's all favored. Just using something for entertainment would not be favored. So even in an educational setting, you can't just run a video in the class because you were worn out and didn't have anything planned for the day and you just want to entertain your students. You can't download pictures just to decorate your syllabus to make it look nice. It needs to be something that's pretty integral to the educational point. So that's probably the thing that we focus on the most as educators, is what we're trying to do. The next thing is the nature of the work. So a published work is always favored for fair use. I think the idea is it's been published, people have had a chance to get it out there and get some return on that. If something is not yet published, that would oppose fair use. The creative person hasn't had a chance to get their return yet. It's not been out in the public as much, so it's a little bit more protected. Then also things that are more factual favor fair use, I think, because keep in mind what copyright is protecting is that expression of an idea, not the idea itself necessarily, although publishing something lays your claim to that idea. But I think in a factual case, you can think of the content being somewhat separated from the expression to some degree. With something that's highly creative, like art, music, a novel, the expression is so foremost. I think it's really difficult to separate the expression from the thing that's being conveyed. So I think that's partly why those tend to be a little bit more protected than things that are more fact-based. So all of those sort of art, music, novels, the sorts of things that we might like to handle or distribute more and that are easy to distribute in our technological area are more protected. And then again, it has to be something that's important to the educational objective, where that's really the focus. It's not just accidental to your educational point. Then the amount is important, and it's important that it's not just the quantity, but it's also the significance of the part that you're using. So there was one of the legal cases that gets cited a lot is when Gerald Ford published his memoirs. I think it was Newsweek or Time magazine sort of scooped it a bit, and they published ahead of time the chapter where he talked about his pardoning of Nixon. And it wasn't a very large portion of the work as a whole, but the publisher argued that's the part everyone was going to buy the book to read. That was the main thing that everybody wanted to see. So they were successfully sued for having used that small portion because it was the heart of the work, or a very significant part of the work. So I sometimes think of this as like if you're sharing a piece of chocolate cake with somebody, you don't expect them to take the entire portion of the cake, nor do you expect them to scrape the icing off the top and eat that and leave you with bare crumbs. So it's the same kind of thing. If you're asking to use somebody's thing, you don't take the best part of it necessarily. You don't take all of it. You're using just a sample of it. I see there's something in the chat, so let me just check that real quick and see. Yes, thank you, Julie, for posting that fair use checklist. So you need to consider the amount and the centrality of it for what you're using. And again, use the amount that you really need to use to make your point. So don't try to extend extra unless you absolutely need that content to make the point that you're trying to make. And then finally, this is probably the point that certainly the commercial creators think about most, is the effect on the market. And again, if we're being ethical too, we're thinking about that balance, we want creative people to get the return on their creative investment. So we don't want to undercut their market. We want to be fair about this. So if we've purchased a lawful copy, like of a DVD, we have given them some return on that investment, and then we're just doing what we need to make it more usable. If we're only distributing a couple of copies, that's usually fine. If there's no particular market for something, say a book is still covered by copyright, but there's no copy in print, we can't find it anywhere, that's usually an argument for going ahead and making a copy of that. And that's one of the things the libraries will evaluate. We cannot find, we've exhausted all the possibilities to try to find this. It simply is not findable. We can't find the copyright holder to get permission. There doesn't seem to be any market remaining for this material. That might justify making a copy, or if there's no licensing mechanism. Opposing fair use would be, this is a little bit newer, I think, if there is a workable licensing mechanism. So as I mentioned before, for library resources, a lot of times we are relying on those licenses. And they may seem expensive to us sometimes, like licensing a streaming video. One video might cost about $150 to $300 for a semester's access. And then at the end of the semester, that disappears. But if you get a large amount of use out of that, that may be a reasonable amount to pay for that. So we don't want to undercut the sale for the original. Also, if you're planning to use something repeatedly, like I know sometimes someone will find a good reading that they want and they want to put it on e-reserves, or they want to use it again and again and again in a class, you're basically then creating an anthology. That would be sort of like a derivative work. So if you're using something once, that's usually not a problem. If you're planning to be reusing things over and over again, I would really recommend using our e-reserve service, and we take care of the copyright angles for that when that happens. Okay, last step. If you've gone through all of this and you're still not sure, you think what you want to do is covered by copyright, you don't think you can make a good fair use argument, it doesn't seem to fit the exceptions, then you are going to look at needing to get permission or see if it can be licensed in some ways. And again, we're very happy to help with this. This can be a little bit tricky sometimes. We do have, this is one page from our copyright guide. So we've got the permissions tab there. We've got some model permission letters that you can use that contain all the aspects that would need to be covered if you're asking for permission for something. Sometimes it can be tricky to find who do you ask permission from. So I was helping a professor recently who wants to write an adaptation of some novels. The author has died. Her heirs or executors renewed the copyright. They have died. So we had to go through them steps to find out who actually has the authorization now to give this permission for this purpose. And these works are going to be under copyright for another 5 years yet. So we really needed to get that permission, find out who it was. So we can help you out with that. There are also a number of collective licensing agencies. So the Copyright Clearance Center is one that's used a lot for academic writing for articles or chapters in books. So they handle dispensing the permissions and collecting the royalties for things that are of that nature. And that's what we use when we do, when we take care of permissions for articles that are on e-reserves. We'll end up paying copyright fees through the Copyright Clearance Center, and those fees can vary. So the library does have a budget to cover that for reserves. So we can cover up to, I think it's about $500 per class we'll spend on either licensing or getting permissions for things. There are other things like Judy, maybe I'm sure you're aware of ASCAP and some of the others that are particular for music, where they license things for composers and performers. The other thing I should mention, sometimes you'll have multiple layers of permissions. Music is a good example. If you've got a recording, you might be dealing with the permissions from the composer, from the performer, and from the recording company. So there's sort of multiple layers. So sometimes these licensing agencies can be really helpful in dealing with all those different layers of permissions you might need. Also, sometimes it can get a little thorny. For example, we've seen with things in journalism, sometimes if a freelance writer has written something for a paper, the freelance writer may have retained the copyright. So we might have to find that particular writer rather than the newspaper that might normally hold the copyright. Or the same thing with photographs. Sometimes the photographer has retained the rights. The book is covered by the copyright for the publisher, but then we have to find the photographer to actually get permissions for that. You'll sometimes see in online environments too, there will be gaps because when the online company digitized like a whole run of a newspaper, they didn't want to go negotiate with the freelance writers or the photographers. So they just dropped that content out. So sometimes there are these sort of missing pieces that we can help with finding as well. let me stop for just a second. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for just a sec and see, so I can see you all and see, do you have any questions at this point? I've kind of run through a lot of stuff pretty quickly. Is this kind of making sense? Okay. The last part that I've got is just to show you some of our other resources, but would any of you like to take a scenario and walk it through? I'm happy to do that if one of you has an example, and we could go through this process of kind of thinking through it and see how that works in real life. But I don't want to put anyone on the spot either if you don't feel like doing that. Judy.
I'll jump in.
Okay.
If you have something that is a foreign copyright that you want to use, and this could be for your own research. I mean, that's why I'm thinking of it, but it could also be in a classroom setting where the copyright rules may be different, or the length of time in which you have to observe before it's out of copyright could be different.
I think that's one of those things where it depends. And I think at the very end, we'll go and we'll look live at that chart from Cornell. I think they've done a good job. They really have gone through all the different possible parameters. I think one of the things it depends on, if I'm not mistaken, is if the country is a signatory to the World Intellectual Property Organization agreement. So it may depend on what copyright treaty they have signed. So my understanding, I think, like we're at the US are WIPO members, and we've signed I think it's the Barron Treaty, I think is the one. So all signatories to those have agreed that copyright in the home of the user is what applies. So I think like for materials from the UK, if we're using it in the US, our copyright terms apply. And that's partly why our copyright law changed to have this longer term. We were coming more into compliance with the other international organizations. Everybody would feel comfortable. So it's that share alike idea. You know, we'll treat your stuff like we treat our stuff. You treat our stuff like you treat your stuff, kind of thing. So that's my understanding of it. I should probably check in with legal counsel, make sure my understanding is completely up to date and correct, but that's generally the way I've seen that working. Is that satisfactory to go on with?
Thank you, Anne.
Okay.
Yes.
Any other questions? Okay, well, let me just go back to sharing, and I'll show you some more of the resources that we have, just so you can get an idea what we've got out there. Okay. So if you go to our instructional services page, you can see at the top of the screen, there's libraryguides.missouri.edu instruction, or if you were on our main page under class resources, you'll see this tab here. This will take you to this instructional services page. Joe Askins is the one who maintains this, so it's looking very nice. And we've got a couple of things over here on the left. So there is this integrating library support in Canvas. So I'd recommend looking at this, and then this video in the virtual classroom are two things I wanted to draw your attention to. So integrating library content in Canvas, I think, is important that Teach Act and the online teaching, that applies to any online delivery. So the whole class doesn't have to be online, but if you are delivering content via an online system like Canvas, that would apply. We really recommend linking wherever possible. That gets around the whole copyright issue, because copyright does involve, again, remember, it's the copying, distributing. So even making a copy of something to upload it to Canvas, yes, you're making a copy and you're distributing it. So you've already done two things with copyright right there. So linking to things is just putting a signpost and pointing the students, go find it here. So that generally will sort of avoid that whole concern. It's really easy for students, and all of the products that we have, the licensing allows for these linking. Most of them have developed systems that provide a permanent URL, make it easy to link to things. So we've gone through on the left here, you can see how to link to journals, how to link to specific articles, how to link to a chapter in a book or a particular point in an encyclopedia article. When we do digital video, streaming video, we'll get a link that then can be embedded also. So you can link to these things. And again, we're like with YouTube videos, they usually have a provision for sharing where you can embed the link or you can copy a link. That's much more preferable to downloading and then uploading again. We also want to encourage this because when people link to articles or databases that we've provided, we get usage statistics off of those links. And with our current budget situation, it's just really tight. So every year we are evaluating what's getting used, what's not getting used. So rather than building the big permanent collection that would have been the pride of a library in the past, we're tending to build a dynamic responsive collection. So if we see something hasn't gotten much use for several years, we may drop that off in order to be able to afford to get something that's been getting more use. If that then falls out of use, we may drop that off, resubscribe to something that is now getting more use. So it's much more dynamic. So it's really helpful for us to be able to see what's being used. And if you download a PDF and then upload it to Canvas, that looks like one use to us. We don't see how much your students might be using it. So I'd really encourage you to do that. And then you can also see this using Discover at MU Reading List Maker. That's the thing, our Discover at MU is our main search box, and there are ways you can create a reading list within that, so it captures the links from the different articles and books that are available there to provide them to your students. And then we have the e-reserves thing as well. So if you've got something that's in print that doesn't exist electronically, you'd like for us to scan it and make it available on e-reserves, we can do that, and then we take care of all the copyright mess that might be associated with that. So hopefully there won't be any copyright fees. If there are, we'll take care of that and you don't even have to think about it. So I just wanted you to be aware of this guide, and this will be something to refer back to. And as things change, we'll be keeping this up to date. This guide to video in the classroom is something we developed right when the pandemic started, when suddenly everything went online and we needed everything, all the film classes that have been using DVDs from our collection needed to be able to stream video. So we did a lot of exploring of what the options were and what we could do. So we do license videos for classes. Unfortunately, our budget doesn't allow us to get a large online streaming collection. So again, we're being responsive. So as people request streaming video for classes, we've got a limited budget. So we do limit how much we'll spend per class. But we can then license films from Canopy and other sources, Alexander Street. So we've got a whole variety of places. So these different, I think these different links will take you to where you can look through what the different options are, what might be available from where. There is some video that's in the public domain, and then there are also individual streaming options. So we've got some sources that will show us something on Amazon Prime or on one of the other streaming things. Sometimes that is actually a lot less expensive and students may already have a subscription to that, or we might have access to the public library, which does have a Canopy streaming service. So those are all sort of things to help you out. And then you can use portions of a film in accordance with the Teach Act. You can, this is gone where I can't see it. There's some other options. You can screen a film through Zoom, so you can watch it on your own computer and transmit it through Zoom so that students can't capture that necessarily. That doesn't always have the highest quality. But again, we're happy to work with you on this. We have had a couple of cases where a professor wanted to use a film that was not really in distribution. It only existed in VHS tape or on a DVD. And then we'll walk through the process of getting the permissions to do whatever we need to do to make that more available. So we have contacted people and said, you know, we can't find any other option for this. We really want to use it for a class. Can we make a copy? Can we break the encryption and make a copy of that so that we can stream it and limit that access just to that class? And then finally, this is our copyright guide. So again, libraryguides.missouri.edu/copyright will take you here. And this has a lot more information. So I've basically covered this first page on here of the copyright basics, and this is the copyright decision flowchart, which is sort of the steps we've just gone through. And these different links take you to these different pages that have a lot more information on each of these things. This page, this whole guide has been vetted by University Legal Counsel. So it was based on some work that was done at UMKC, and then Legal Counsel has vetted it a couple times to make sure we're up to date. So we feel pretty confident of all the information that's here. So I hope that will prove to be helpful.